it's long been known for being a little different.
It's an eclectic neighborhood full of all different types of people.
Free-spirited, artistic, creative.
I think this has always been a very eclectic place.
And while eclectic may be the term that comes to mind most often for the people who live in the Whitaker neighborhood, it's not necessarily how the rest of Eugene sees it.
Felony flats, oh, you live in the Whitaker? Oh, yeah.
You know, they called this the ghetto.
We're full of drug dealers, drunks, alcoholics, you know, and we're gonna key your cars and your Beamers when they come on down to the Whitaker.
But regardless of what you think of it, none of the descriptions that apply today would have fit when the neighborhood first began taking shape.
A lot of history of Eugene. You know, this was the first neighborhood of Eugene.
This particular area has got one heck of a history.
But I know it's like the oldest neighborhood.
Whitaker's roots traced back to 1847.
It used to be the former crossroads of Eugene.
People came here, they got their feed and seed at the barn. They, you know, had a little booze over here, and a little snack over there. It was where all the farmers came.
Those farmers moving their crops north via Blair Boulevard, which back then served as the main stagecoach road for travelers making their way from Eugene to Corvallis and Portland.
All traffic had to go through Blair. The Wayne Morris called Blair Boulevard the blue-collar Main Street. He said Willamette Street was the Chamber of Commerce Main Street. Because, you know, those were all farms out there in River Road.
The farming community welcomed new neighbors a short time later when the railroad tracks were laid in.
It mostly was the home for railroad workers 100 and some years ago.
All blue-collar. The railroad, the farms. And this was the highway. There was no Chambers connector. And so all traffic going to River Road, Santa Clara, had to go right down Blair.
At the center of it all, the neighborhood's original iconic structures.
The Tiny Tavern is notorious. We know people who say that their grandparents came to the Tiny Tavern, you know, so it's an institution.
Oh, you don't know how that was back in the day. It was the most beautiful bar in town. It was a neighborhood nucleus. People all came there. It was the Queen.
The Tiny Tavern, built in 1895, was the original centerpiece of the neighborhood, though the building bearing its name today is now the home of Papa's Soul Food.
There was a speakeasy before Prohibition. It was called Tiny's Tea House. Tea. After Prohibition, Lucille and Tiny moved over here. They bought it from the farmers, and they made the Tiny Tavern. Not Tiny's Tavern, the Tiny Tavern.
The tavern wasn't alone, though. Just across the street, another would-be landmark went up.
Red Barnum was built in 1913 as a blacksmith shop.
The final leg of the neighborhood triangle, Sam Bond's Garage, was built 5 years later.
That's how it looked. Now it's a bar. Sam was a great guy. He was a crackerjack mechanic, is what he was called in those days. I think he was there for about 40 years. Everybody in town knew Sam.
The neighborhood grew, but the rest of the city did too, prompting the construction of new roads and highways, one of which would have a lasting impact on how the neighborhood was physically defined.
The freeway changed all the definition of the borders. It cut our neighborhood basically in half.
Highway 126 and the Washington Jefferson Street Bridge on and off ramps literally split Whitaker in two.
It seemed like that kind of divided the Whitaker in the first place in the 60s when they put that in there, because you can see other houses on the other side that look like, you know, kind of funky communal houses and stuff like that.
And then at some point, as we were wrestling with how to grow and how to deal with traffic and travel and moving people around, at some point they made the decision to have the freeway kind of come into this neighborhood, which is what gave birth to the that division in the community, which is still a challenge.
The Whitaker neighborhood would never be the same again. Another decade passed, and even the people who lived there started going through a transformation.
It was really part of the political heart of Eugene or in the 70s, and a lot of the big movements that happened in this community, from peace, environment, and so forth, came sort of a connection between the Whitaker probably and the university.
Farmers and railroad workers were no longer the norm. Further changes to other parts of the city would continue contributing to the neighborhood's makeover.
They closed off Willamette Street. They put a stone fountain in there, which they later closed down the fountain. And they removed all the alternative counterculture people from downtown, and they got dispersed. Many came here.
They were seeds, if you will, planted in the homes and streets of the neighborhood, which blossomed years later, providing a new chapter in Whitaker's story, a new reputation, a notoriety that defined the Whit to outside onlookers.